getting on the internet, cyberspace, set free, hello virtual reality. Interactive appetite, searching for a website, a window to the world, got to get online. Take a spin, now you're in with the techno set, you're going surfing on the internet.
Let's talk about the Macarena, Friends, Star Wars, The Phantom Menace, and the internet. Let's talk about post-Cold War America in the 1990s. And really, from 1991 onward, there's not too terribly much that College Board wants you to know. Again, 4% of the exam, if we go back, 5% of the exam comes from the time period 1980 to the present. And within that 5%, the vast majority of that comes from the Reagan era. And there's really two things you need to know with the Reagan era, of course. The Reagan Revolution, the conservative coalition that brings Reagan to power, what Reagan does while in office, trying to shrink the government and sort of setting aside Keynesian economic policies, shrinking the welfare state, and then finally, along with that, the end of the Cold War. So, in other words, this is a video on the small off chance that you get a question from beyond 1991, either in the multiple choice section or on a short answer question. And if you do get that kind of question, it's probably going to cover one of just a few topics. But the big topic that College Board kind of likes to emphasize after the end of the Cold War is something called globalization. And that's sort of the thing that dominates the 1990s. So let's kind of pick it up with the end of Ronald Reagan. And one of my arguments, or an argument that you can make, is that the world after 1980, or the world after Reagan, is still a Reagan era. Because in 1992, George H.W. Bush is running for re-election. And George H.W. Bush is a president who has accumulated a surprising number of foreign policy successes. He's negotiated the end of the Cold War, sort of finishing up what Reagan has started, and he also puts together a very powerful coalition that reins in Saddam Hussein in Iraq during the first Persian Gulf War. So, in other words, George H.W. Bush really should win in a landslide, and then he says the following.
Read my lips. No new taxes.
So, what do you think George H.W. Bush does? Well, if you said raise taxes, you'd be right. So, this actually splits Reagan's conservative coalition. Because remember, there are a lot of pro-business conservatives that basically want the government to reduce taxes, to reduce the size of government. Those two things tend to be related. And so many of those business conservatives flock to the Reform Party led by Ross Perot, a corporate executive from Texas Instruments. Maybe, I guess you can thank him possibly for your scientific calculator, if that is indeed something you feel thankful for. So this basically splits the Republican Party. Likely Republican voters are sort of split between Bush and Perot, and that actually opens the door for a Southern governor from Arkansas by the name of William Jefferson Clinton to coast to the White House. Now, Bill Clinton, like Jimmy Carter, is a Southern governor, and that, again, is something that we see during the 70s, 80s, and 90s to a certain, well, actually more of the 70s and 90s, because remember that with the Nixon administration, the South is increasingly voting for the Republican Party, and you start to see Democrats trying to maintain a foothold, a presence in the South. So Bill Clinton is elected president in 1992. Now, that being said, you might remember in our last lecture, or maybe a lecture or so before that Bill Clinton is a new type of Democrat. He is not a New Deal Democrat because, remember, the New Deal Democrats believe in the expansion of government, a powerful welfare state, and a government that is intimately involved in the lives of everybody. And instead, Bill Clinton says this.
The era of big government is over.
He's also famous for saying this.
I want you to listen to me. I'm going to say this again. I did not have sexual relations with that woman, Miss Lewinsky.
I did not.
So Bill Clinton is actually proven factually wrong on both counts. But going back to the first quote, the era of big government is over. Just think about that. The Democratic Party is the party of big government, at least since circa 1932. So how can you be against the idea of big government and be the party of big government? And the answer is that the Democratic Party is kind of reinventing itself, or at least it's responding to the changes that Ronald Reagan and his revolution brings about. In the same way that there is a bipartisan consensus that the New Deal works after World War II between Republicans and Democrats, there's also let's say a less powerful consensus after Ronald Reagan that the government should basically stay out of the economy as much as possible. Now, Bill Clinton is not a complete throwback to the laissez-faire Democratic Party of the 1880s and 1890s. He does try to pass healthcare reform, but for various reasons, including Republican opposition in Congress, that gets shot down. And so Bill Clinton's presidency is, I don't want to say that he doesn't do anything, but like many presidencies, including that of Clinton's idol, John F. Kennedy, he's constantly fighting congressional opposition. And of course, this happens most famously in a Republican resurgence in 1994, where basically the Republican Party manages to sweep congressional elections. And a phrase that you sometimes see on the AP exam is Newt Gingrich's. This is the Speaker of the House during the early 90s. Newt Gingrich's contract with America, in which basically Republicans promise that if they're elected, they're going to continue kind of pushing back against the size of government and pass sort of a broad series of reforms that are similar to some of the ideas of the Reagan Revolution. The one thing that, interestingly, they promised that they did not really hold to is the idea of congressional term limits. And by the way, that tends to be kind of a bipartisan thing where anybody who campaigns on term limits, let's just say, if that makes you suspicious or cynical, well, you should be. But the story of the 1990s isn't the story of Bill Clinton or anything that's really going on in Washington. Really, the story of the 1990s is about some seismic changes in both the U.S. and the global economy. In fact, we're talking about globalization. And this is a word that gets abused a lot, and this is one of the topics or concepts that College Board really likes to emphasize, if they emphasize anything from this era. So globalization is a term that we use to describe the lifting of barriers and restrictions to the exchange of goods, ideas, and people across the world. Now, globalization is nothing new. The idea of removing things like trade restrictions, tariffs, that was the thing that Woodrow Wilson kind of prattled on about at Versailles. And you can kind of make the argument that we've seen numerous instances across history where the world becomes very globalized, that restrictions for trade are kind of lifted. During the heyday of the British Empire, for instance, this is a world that you can kind of argue was a very globalized one, since the British really emphasized the elimination of tariffs and barriers for trade. But what we can kind of see is that during the 1990s, you almost had this perfect storm where multiple factors emerge at once that kind of encourage a more globalized economy, both in the United States and across the world. And some of those factors should make a lot of sense. After the end of the Cold War, you have the fall of the Berlin Wall, and also other sort of barriers set up throughout Eastern Europe that prevented the movement of goods and people and ideas. Now, in that case, we're not just talking about legal barriers, sort of metaphorical barriers. We're talking about literal barriers that are removed after the Cold War. So that's one. And, after the end of the Cold War, we see the emergence of new states, or let's say rebooted states like the Russian Federation. And because of the lifting of those restrictions, you have Western venture capitalists from, New York and London that fly into Moscow, the fertile crescent of communism, in an effort to finance Russian startup businesses. So it's a very different world than the one we saw in the Cold War, and a world that broadly kind of supports laissez-faire capitalism. And again, it's sort of a shift away from the more controlled form of capitalism that we see emerge after World War II until the emergence of Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher. You also see the emergence of free trade organizations, or organizations that encourage the elimination of barriers for trade. This includes the World Trade Organization and asterisk NAFTA. I think I put in an extra A there, but it's okay. NAFTA is short for the North American Free Trade Agreement. And basically, this eliminates tariffs between the United States, Mexico, and Canada, encouraging sort of the free flow of goods, and very often people along with those goods, across the borders. Now, NAFTA is one of those things that was very, let's say, controversial when it was enacted, but it's also become controversial since, because NAFTA also kind of facilitates this process that we've been talking about since the 1970s, and that is deindustrialization. The fact that industries throughout the United States, and specifically northern states, they're beginning to uproot and find cheaper labor markets. Now, some of those industries move just south to the Sun Belt area during the Cold War. And to be honest, we're kind of one of the beneficiaries of that a lot of industries, like a lot of car companies, for example, they relocate to places like Spartanburg, South Carolina. But beyond that, you do see some industries that migrate to countries like Mexico. And if you look at the impact of NAFTA as a whole, if you look at the accounting perspective, the big picture perspective, we can say that NAFTA does lead to the United States, Canada, and Mexico becoming more prosperous. You do see the growth in large increases in the growth of all three of these economies. If you look at figures like a gross domestic product, but most people are not interested in the gross domestic product. They're interested in their domestic product. They're interested in their economy. And so what we know is that because of deindustrialization and outsourcing, there are a lot of jobs, especially like middle-class blue-collar jobs. And again, those are that's not a contradiction in terms in the 90s. They're lost because of NAFTA. I think I may have said nearly 1,950,000 jobs are lost during this transition. So yeah, we have kind of two pictures here. We have the fact that NAFTA causes economic growth, but we also see that there are casualties. And by the way, not just casualties in the United States. Mexican farmers are actually hurt very, very hard because, or hit very, very hard because they have to compete with American farmers in the Great Plains, and that's kind of tough to do. So we'll pick up a little bit with NAFTA in just a second. But the other thing that we associate with this time period is advances in technology. If you're talking about the exchange of ideas, there's nothing that does that quite like the internet. So believe it or not, the internet, or the technology behind the internet, is actually kind of old. So the first, let's say the alpha build of the internet was something called the ARPANET. And the ARPANET was this, basically this network of computers, for really the Defense Department. These would network computers located in, government facilities, in private universities and think tanks and laboratories. And at the time, the ARPANET wasn't created to sort of build the predecessor of Wikipedia or Facebook. There was no sort of transformative mission. Basically, this was technology that was designed to make the Cold War more efficient. Obviously, one of the questions that you might have is, well, if you have state secrets or important classified information located in Washington, D.C., well, what happens if Washington gets nuked? Well, the idea is that if you have computers operating on the same network and that information is stored redundantly on different servers and different systems, well, then you don't have to start from scratch. So it is something that really begins to answer a very, very simple question or a simple problem. But of course, it builds on itself because what we know is that a lot of times technologies that are developed in wartime make their way to the marketplace, maybe 5, 10 years after the fact, but eventually. So what happens is that Vint Cerf is the somebody who's kind of credited with developing the internet, but the internet is really the infrastructure. It's kind of like the railroad, but you can build a railroad, but unless you have something that can go on the railroad, then it's kind of pointless. Well, the person who develops the train, or the World Wide Web, basically the software that sort of bunches and combines web pages together, is a British computer scientist by the name of Tim Berners-Lee. This guy right here. Here's his front side as well as his back side. This is, by the way, Vint Cerf and Tim Berners-Lee together. And both of those individuals are people who are probably kind of relatively unknown today, but in 100 years' time, in 200 years' time, there's every indication that they'll become names like, Tesla, like Edison. Again, one of the inventors that really sort of create the architecture of the modern world. And because of that, the United States, sort of shifts away from industry in the 90s and instead embraces the growth of technology. Bill Clinton actually talks about this during the 90s, that he sort of envisions the future of the United States as sort of shifting away from industry and embracing technology in Silicon Valley. Now, coinciding with NAFTA and the passage of the Immigration Act of 1965, you do see, let's say, a more diverse pool of immigrants, many of them coming in from Latin America for work. And we've talked about the fact that there was a demand for basically sharecroppers in states like California and the West in general. And that increases significantly during this time period at precisely the same time that we also see kind of this deindustrialization occur in the United States. And you also see another complication related to globalization, and that is the global recession of, it says 2008, it really should be kind of 2007, but 2008 is where it really sort of peaks. And there's a question mark here because we're still not really sure what the overall impact of this is going to be. This is where, again, we're sort of leaving history behind and actually getting into kind of current events, arguably. So with marketplaces becoming more interconnected, the issue is that when the United States sneezes, the rest of the world basically catches the flu. And so don't let the phrase or the term, the subprime mortgage crisis, confuse you. That might make it seem like it's kind of a nothing thing, but in reality, the United States experiences a banking crisis almost as bad as the one it experiences in the darkest days of the Depression. And what's interesting is that in response to this, you have this bipartisan consensus to kind of kick it old school. Both Presidents George W. Bush and Barack Obama actually revive some of the ideas of John Maynard Keynes, the idea of using government money to stimulate the economy in the event of an economic downturn. So, for example, in 2007 and 2008, President George W. Bush of the Republican Party, and kind of somebody in that Reagan tradition, passes a very modest $700 billion relief package. And the thing that is different, though, about, let's say, the New Deal and the response to the Great Recession is that whereas the New Deal was basically structured to get people back to work, really most of the government's attention is focused on the banks and big businesses. And remember that in some respects, the focus is on the banks for the same reason that FDR was worried about the banking sector, that if you don't have banks, at the end of the day, you're not really going to have an economic engine. That a lot of the economy is based on the assumption that businesses and individuals can basically get loans to find money that they don't have. And if you don't have banks, well, you don't really have that. But not only are banks like Lehman Brothers, the recipients of federal aid. You also have companies like General Motors. And I mean, think about this. If we're talking about symbols of deindustrialization, General Motors, like one of the companies that basically made the United States the industrial center of the world, almost collapses entirely until the government basically comes in and bails it out. And you see these. I mean, a lot of images like these are circulating around the internet. Some of them for political purposes, some not. But really, I think it's just important to look at Detroit. Detroit is basically the nerve center of America's industrial economy. During and after World War II, it has some of the highest living standards in the world. And Detroit is just absolutely gutted because of the recession, but also just because of deindustrialization. There's another thing that's going on in this time, and that is the fact that after the civil rights era, you see this process called suburbanization occur, where many white people in big cities like Detroit, Chicago, etc., they begin to relocate and settle in suburbs surrounding these cities. But the fact is that you see these very stunning before and after pictures of just kind of the industrial heartland getting sort of hollowed out. So there's a couple things we can say about the recession. The Great Recession was not as bad as the Great Depression, but that goal is almost like pathetically. That's a pathetically sort of humble or unambitious goal, right? We can say that our unemployment peaks at about 10 to 12%, but we don't experience like the 25% unemployment rates that countries in Europe like Italy, Greece, and Spain experience. Our employment eventually bounces back, but here's the asterisk. Employment numbers don't measure if your job is good or how much it pays or the benefits. It only measures if you are employed in some capacity, full-time, part-time, as like a one-off thing. That's the only thing it takes into account. So if you dig a little deeper, what we find is that the jobs that are lost in the recession are many of these middle-class jobs that you could obtain by being a blue-collar worker. Middle management jobs that sort of labor unions helped make possible during the 20s, 30s, and 40s. Those jobs that you could get without a college degree, they get eliminated. And they don't really come back after the recession. And so this sort of exacerbates this process that we see throughout the 20th century, and that is this income gap between those people with college degrees, especially 4-year degrees, and those without. And it sort of helps grow this income gap in the United States. In some respects, you could kind of argue that we see a lot of the same political issues of the Gilded Age in the 1990s and early 2000s, with the fact that society as a whole, beyond the Great Recession, does become wealthier, but there are some very clear winners and also some losers, and even just some people who don't really see as much benefit in this sort of more globalized economy.